The Golden Age label is thrown around a lot. It's a term we actually got from the ancient Greeks, and as a result, we have classified a golden age of piracy, a golden age of Hollywood, a golden age of comic books, and, particular to this, a golden age of science fiction. Now, the exact dates of the golden age of sci-fi vary depending on who you ask. I'm going to be horribly reductionist right now because I'm only talking for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to squeeze about 20 years of science fiction ranging from the late 30s to the mid 50s all into one episode. In this period, this is where we see the development of famous authors like Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, and Robert A. Heinlein, just to name a few of the classics. Most Golden Age sci-fi is of the hard variety, which is not as dirty as it sounds. Basically, hard science fiction focuses on science itself to both create and to solve a story's problem. The classic hard sci-fi story of the Golden Age is almost like a logic puzzle that the reader is encouraged to solve through their knowledge of physics or chemistry or anything like that. For example, you have Tom Godwin's The Cold Equations, which focuses on someone who stows away on a rocket ship, but the stowaway's extra mass throws off the rocket's fuel equations, so it cannot get to where it needs to go. Disaster ensues. Not all Golden Age sci-fi is necessarily that hard. For example, Doc E. E. Smith developed space opera, which is a subgenre that he started with Skylark of Space in 1946 and developed it more in the Lensman novels, which started in 1948. Space opera is basically Star Wars, and it's one of the most popular subgenres of sci-fi today. Atomic energy was one of the biggest driving ideas behind the Golden Age of sci-fi. Nuclear power seemed to offer unlimited potential both for creation and for destruction, and as time went on, more and more stories began to deal with the potential end of the world, or they would at least use nuclear radiation as a plot device for something terrible to happen. Dipping into the film side of things, two great examples of the whole nuclear monster movie both came out in 1954. From the United States, we have Them, and from Japan, Godzilla. Meanwhile, in fantasy, an Oxford English professor would release a genre-defining work of his own. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit was released in 1937 and soon took off to become a huge bestseller. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you've already read The Hobbit, or at least I hope you have, because the movie adaptations tend to be terrible. There's a lot going on with The Hobbit. For one, it's more geared for children than it is for the sexy and violent pulp tales from the pulp magazines. On top of that, The Hobbit is super English. Bilbo Baggins and the Shire are more or less idealized versions of English pastoral life. It's basically Downton Abbey with hairy feet. The Lord of the Rings hit the shelves in 1954, 17 years after The Hobbit. So, you should probably get off George R.R. Martin's case about the next Game of Thrones book. The Lord of the Rings is a lot broader in scope than The Hobbit. It's a big story about the clash between good and evil and kings and dwarves and hobbits and wizards. And I'm assuming, again, you've already read it or at least watched the movies because the Peter Jackson ones are actually, good. Now, with that, Tolkien went on to influence the fantasy genre to this very day, and we'll get into that in later episodes. Now, in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and set off the space race. Suddenly, all the atomic rockets and satellites and all the stuff that all these Golden Age sci-fi writers had cooked up seemed a lot more plausible and a lot more mundane. So, plain gee whiz, let's go build a rocket kind of stories weren't as popular anymore. Thankfully, science fiction writers kept on thinking of new ideas and bringing in new elements, which leads us to the 60s and the 70s and what's known as the new wave of science fiction, which we'll cover next week.